My name is Brandon, I'm 22 years old, and at the time this happened, I was studying history at a university in southern Ohio. During summer break, I usually returned to the small town where my parents lived in rural Kentucky to earn some extra money doing temporary jobs. In the summer of 2023, a family friend told me that the caretaker of an old rural cemetery needed help for a few weeks clearing graves, cutting overgrown grass, and organizing tools after a series of storms had scattered branches all over the property. It wasn't exactly my dream job, but it paid well and would only last a month. As the days went by, I got used to the place. The cemetery was old, surrounded by enormous trees, and divided into a newer section and a much older one, where there were 19th century headstones and several stone mausoleums badly worn by time. During the day, it was a quiet place, but it never seemed frightening to me. Most of the time, I worked alongside the caretaker, an older man named Frank, who knew practically every family buried there. On my last day of work, a severe storm swept through the area during the afternoon. It rained for almost 2 hours, knocking down small branches and scattering leaves across several sections of the cemetery. When the rain finally stopped, Frank had to leave early because of a family emergency. He asked me to simply put the tools away in the storage shed behind the cemetery before heading home. I figured it would take no more than 20 minutes. The sky was already growing dark and a thin layer of mist was beginning to rise from the wet grass. I placed the shovels, hose, rakes, and wheelbarrow inside the small wooden shed, made sure everything was organized, and locked the door with a padlock. The shed was located in the most remote part of the cemetery, behind the old mausoleum section, where there was almost no lighting. I was using only a handheld LED flashlight because the cemetery lights were still out after the storm. Just as I slipped the padlock key into my pocket, I heard someone softly whistling among the graves. It wasn't loud. It sounded like someone strolling without any hurry, while repeating the same short melody over and over again. At first, I thought Frank had come back to retrieve something he had forgotten. I even called out his name, but no one answered. The whistling continued at exactly the same pace, coming from the oldest part of the cemetery. I raised my flashlight and walked several yards between the headstones, trying to locate whoever was there. The beam cut through the thin mist still covering the ground, illuminating only small patches at a time. When the whistling suddenly stopped, the only thing I could see was a shovel stuck upright in a mound of damp soil between two very old graves. I was certain that shovel hadn't been there just a few minutes earlier, because I had just put away every single tool in the shed. I walked toward it slowly to see if someone was hiding behind the headstones, but I found no one. Beside the shovel were fresh boot prints pressed into the wet earth. The footprints continued in a straight line toward an old stone mausoleum covered in moss. When I shined my flashlight on its entrance, all I saw was the iron door, closed and completely still. I stood there watching the mausoleum for several seconds, expecting someone to come out laughing at the prank. Nothing happened. There was almost no wind, and the entire cemetery fell silent again. I decided not to waste any more time. I picked up the shovel, convinced that another worker had simply forgotten it, and walked back to the shed. I unlocked the padlock once more, placed the shovel beside the other tools, checked twice to make sure everything was still neatly arranged, and locked the door again. This time I headed straight for the parking area, where my car was parked near the main gate. When I had gone about halfway there, I remembered I had left my work gloves on a bench near the shed. I sighed, turned around to retrieve them, and nearly dropped my flashlight. The shed door was still locked exactly as I had left it. The padlock was secured, yet every single tool was scattered across the ground outside, as if someone had taken each one out and thrown it onto the wet grass just seconds after I had walked away. I stood completely frozen, trying to understand what I was seeing. The first thing I did was check the padlock. It was still locked, and there wasn't a single sign that the shed had been forced open. I ran my hand across the wooden door just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. It was exactly as I had left it. Even so, shovels, hose, rakes, and even the wheelbarrow were once again scattered across the wet grass. It simply didn't make any sense. I wondered if I had been so exhausted that I had somehow forgotten to put everything away, but I clearly remembered organizing every tool one by one before locking the door. As I struggled to find an explanation, I heard the same whistling again. This time it sounded much closer. It came from the gravel path directly behind me. I immediately swung my flashlight toward the sound. The beam illuminated nothing but old headstones, a few trees, and the low-lying mist. No one was there. The moment I lowered the light to look at the scattered tools again, I heard the whistling once more, now unmistakably coming from behind me. I spun around instantly and for a split second saw a man slowly walking between the graves. He was wearing very old work clothes, a dark coverall stained with dirt, tall boots, and a short-brimmed hat that reminded me of old photographs of gravediggers. His posture was strangely upright, and his arms swung slowly as he walked. Instinctively, I aimed the flashlight directly at his face. The instant I did, he disappeared from the beam. It wasn't like someone running behind a tree. He simply stopped being where I had seen him. I lowered the flashlight by reflex, searching the area, and a few seconds later I spotted him again several yards farther away, walking among another group of graves. The exact same thing happened a second time. Every time the flashlight beam landed directly on his face, I completely lost sight of him. As soon as I shifted the light a few inches to the side, he reappeared farther away, still walking at the same slow pace as if he had never stopped. That was the moment I quit trying to understand what was happening and decided I needed to get out of that cemetery immediately. I dropped my gloves onto the ground and began walking quickly toward the main gate. I didn't want to run because the ground was soaked, and there were exposed roots everywhere between the old graves. Even so, I looked back every few seconds. Each time I did, I saw the man again somewhere else in the cemetery. He never seemed to move quickly. He simply kept walking at the same steady pace, always maintaining a distance that changed depending on where I pointed the flashlight. At one point, I thought he was standing beside a large oak tree. When I shined the flashlight directly at that spot, there was nothing there except the tree trunk. The moment I lowered the beam, I saw him again, now near a cluster of old headstones on the opposite side of the path. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear my own breathing echoing through the silence. I kept walking without stopping until I saw my car parked near the gate. As I reached for the door handle, I heard the same whistle for the third time. This time it sounded like it was coming directly from the path I had to take to leave the cemetery. I got into the car as quickly as I could and locked every door before I even started the engine. While reaching into my pocket for the keys, I looked through the windshield. The man was standing in the middle of the main path about 40 yards away. He remained completely motionless. The dim light from the lamppost near the gate illuminated part of his body, but every time I tried to focus on his face, something seemed to prevent me from making out any details. I started the car and switched on the headlights, shining them directly down the path. There was absolutely no one there. No movement among the trees, no one walking behind a headstone. Just the empty path and the low mist drifting over the grass. I put the car in gear and drove through the gate without looking in the rearview mirror until I was already back on the road. The only thing I wanted was to put as much distance as possible between myself and that place. The following morning, I returned to the cemetery only to give Frank the shed key and collect my pay. I waited until he arrived and told him everything that had happened the night before. He listened without interrupting me, then remained silent for several seconds before answering. He simply said that I wasn't the first person to mention seeing a man walking among the graves after dark. According to him, several former workers preferred finishing their work before sunset because, from time to time, someone reported hearing whistling in the oldest part of the cemetery. When I mentioned the shovel stuck in the ground and the tools appearing outside the shed again, he only asked whether I had stayed after full darkness had fallen. I told him I had. He slowly nodded and changed the subject. Later, before leaving, I stopped by the shed one last time. Every tool was neatly organized inside exactly where it belonged. The shovel I had found between the graves was leaning against the wall with the others. There was no sign whatsoever that they had spent the night scattered across the grass outside. I never accepted another job at that cemetery, and since then I've refused any work that involves staying alone in rural cemeteries after sunset. I've tried to come up with a rational explanation for what happened. Maybe someone had been walking around the cemetery and decided to play a cruel prank on me. Maybe I was exhausted after spending the entire day working in the rain and misunderstood a few things. But there are details I still can't explain. I personally locked that shed twice. I also clearly saw the boot prints leading to the old mausoleum, and I remember exactly the way that man walked among the graves. What I've never been able to forget, though, is one very specific detail. Every time my flashlight beam landed directly on his face, I lost sight of him for a brief moment. The instant I shifted the beam just a few inches to one side, he reappeared farther away, continuing to walk at the same calm pace, as if he were simply waiting for me to give up trying to look directly at him. Story 2. My name is Claire. I'm 30 years old, and I work as a freelance photographer. A large part of my projects involves photographing historic architecture, churches, and old cemeteries for publishers and stock image agencies. Because of that, I spend a lot of time traveling through small towns across the southern United States in search of little-known places. This happened in the fall of 2023, when I visited a small historic cemetery on the outskirts of Hillsborough, in rural North Carolina. The place was known for its 19th century stone funerary sculptures and the century-old trees that covered almost the entire property. I had received permission to photograph there during the afternoon, but I ended up staying much longer than I expected because the late afternoon light was perfect for the kind of images I needed. Before I realized it, most of the visitors had already left. The silence grew heavier as the sun disappeared behind the trees, but I wanted to finish just a few more photographs before leaving. The oldest section of the cemetery was located at the far back, well away from the main entrance. To reach it, I had to walk through several narrow paths between old graves and stone monuments already covered in moss. I carried only my camera and a small backpack with extra lenses. The natural light was fading quickly, but it was still enough to keep photographing. As I searched for a new angle on a very old marble sculpture, I noticed something completely out of place. Between two rows of graves, there was an open grave. The soil around it looked as though it had been disturbed only moments before. The pile of dirt was still damp and a shovel was leaning beside the hole. I immediately stopped to look at it. Before leaving my hotel that morning, I had checked the cemetery's schedule because I didn't want to interfere with any funeral services. There hadn't been a single burial scheduled for that day. Besides that, the rest of the cemetery was completely empty. There were no employees, tractors, or maintenance equipment anywhere near the open grave. I walked just close enough to confirm that it really was a freshly dug grave. I didn't actually look down into the hole. What caught my attention the most was the condition of the soil. It was still dark and damp, as though it had just been removed. There were also fresh boot prints surrounding the excavation, but no tire tracks or signs of machinery that would normally be used for that kind of work. I took 2 photographs simply to document what I had found, thinking that the cemetery administrator might want to know about it later. As I put my camera away again, I heard a faint metallic sound in the distance. It sounded like metal striking metal. At first, I assumed it was the main gate being closed because visiting hours were already over. I looked at my watch and realized I had indeed stayed much longer than I should have. I decided to head back toward the entrance immediately before I had to find an employee to unlock the gate. I walked back through the same path I had taken earlier, but something felt different. The light had faded much more than I expected, and the shadows cast by the trees made it difficult to recognize exactly where I had walked just minutes before. After several minutes, I finally caught sight of the main entrance. My relief lasted only a moment. The iron gate was completely closed. I ran toward it, thinking I would still be able to open it from the inside, but found a heavy chain wrapped around the 2 gate panels with a padlock fastened on the outside. I called out several times for someone, but no one answered. As I gripped the bars, trying to see the road beyond the wall, I heard a footstep behind me. It was a dry sound, like a boot stepping on the gravel path. I immediately turned around. There was no one there. I looked back at the gate and began searching my phone for the administrator's number. That's when I heard another footstep. This time it came from a corridor of graves to my left. I took a few steps in that direction, and the sound stopped. As soon as I changed direction to try walking along the cemetery wall, I heard footsteps again, matching my own pace exactly, always hidden among the stone monuments where I couldn't see whoever was walking with me. At that moment, I tried to stay calm and convince myself that it was probably the caretaker checking to make sure no visitors were still inside the cemetery. I even called out, saying I was still there and needed someone to unlock the gate. The only response was silence. I continued walking through the narrow paths, following the wall in the hope of finding a side gate or some kind of service exit. Every time my footsteps crunched on the gravel, another nearly identical sound echoed several yards ahead, hidden among the graves. If I stopped, it stopped too. If I started walking again, the footsteps resumed almost immediately. I pulled the small flashlight from my backpack, which I always carried for low-light situations, and began illuminating every path before stepping into it. I found no one during the first few attempts. But as I turned into a narrow walkway lined with tall granite monuments, the flashlight beam revealed something that made my entire body freeze. Behind a large gray stone monument, partially hidden in the shadows, stood a completely motionless man. He wore very old work clothes covered in damp dirt. His face, arms, and even his boots were smeared with dark soil, as though he'd just climbed out of an excavation. He was only about 15 yards away. The strangest part was that he didn't seem surprised to see me at all. He simply stood there staring directly at me without saying a word. Instinctively, I took a step backward and raised my flashlight a little higher. At that moment, he slowly stepped back behind the monument. I immediately hurried around the side of the stone structure, thinking I would finally be able to speak to him or find out who he was. But when I rounded the monument, there was absolutely no one there. The corridor was narrow and ended at an old wall. There was nowhere a person could have disappeared so quickly. Before I even had time to process what had happened, I heard those same footsteps again. This time they came from behind me, as though the man had somehow changed positions and begun following me once more. My heart was pounding so hard that I could barely think clearly. I stopped trying to figure out who the man was and focused only on finding a way out. I continued following the cemetery wall, lighting every section ahead of me with my flashlight. The footsteps remained behind me the entire time. Never too close, but never completely disappearing either. Eventually, I found a small service gate along the side of the property. I ran toward it, convinced I had finally found a way out. When I grabbed the handle, I discovered it too was secured with a padlock. At that very moment, I heard another sound coming from the direction of the open grave. It was no longer just footsteps. It sounded like a shovel striking damp earth, followed by several seconds of silence, then another strike. The sound repeated itself at steady intervals. Even though I couldn't see that part of the cemetery, I had the distinct impression that someone was still digging long after everyone else had gone home. I stood frozen for several seconds, trying to decide whether I should return to the main entrance or attempt to climb the cemetery wall. Then I remembered that when I had first arrived, I had noticed a small maintenance building near the main gate. I ran back along a different path, hoping to find an employee. As I approached the entrance, I saw that there was a light on inside the building. I knocked loudly on the door and called out several times. An elderly man opened it a few seconds later, clearly surprised to see me. I quickly explained that the gate had been locked while I was still inside the cemetery. He apologized, saying he had assumed all the visitors had already left before locking the entrance. As he walked toward the gate carrying a large ring of keys, I told him about the open grave and the man covered in mud whom I had seen among the monuments. The caretaker stopped for a moment, looked toward the old section of the cemetery, and simply replied that no excavation had been authorized that day. He then unlocked the gate and asked me to leave before it got completely dark. Judging by the tone of his voice, I had the impression he preferred to end the conversation right there. Before getting into my car, I looked one last time toward the oldest section of the cemetery. My flashlight barely reached that far anymore, but I could still make out the outlines of the taller monuments between the trees. For a brief moment, I thought I saw someone standing in the exact same corridor where I had encountered the mud-covered man. I couldn't distinguish any details beyond the silhouette. I blinked a few times and shined the flashlight there again. No one was there anymore. I got into my car and drove away without even checking the photographs I had taken. I didn't do that until I returned to my hotel. Among the images of the sculptures and old graves, I found the 2 photographs I had taken of the open grave. They clearly showed the freshly disturbed mound of dirt and the shovel leaning beside the excavation. But there was one detail I didn't remember seeing in person. In the background of both photographs, partially hidden behind a stone monument, someone was standing and looking directly toward the camera. The figure was too far away for the face to be clear, but the clothing appeared to be completely covered in dark stains of mud. The following morning, before driving home, I called the cemetery administration to report the open grave. The employee who answered said she would send someone to check immediately. A few hours later, she called me back. She told me they had found no open grave in the area I described. Every grave was intact and no excavation work had been carried out during the previous several days. She also asked whether I was certain I hadn't mistaken the location, but I knew exactly where I had been. I never returned to that cemetery. I still photograph historic buildings, but now I always make sure to check the closing hours carefully and never remain inside cemeteries after the staff begins leaving for the day. What continues to bother me the most isn't the mud-covered man or the footsteps following me between the paths. It's the fact that I saw an open grave where, according to the cemetery administration, no excavation had ever existed. And when I look at those two photographs even today, I can still see the same figure standing behind the monument, staring directly toward where I was. Story 3. My name is Daniel. I'm 46 years old, and I live in a small town in rural Tennessee. My wife passed away in a car accident 6 years ago, and ever since then, I've kept a habit that I've never been able to give up. Every year on the anniversary of her death, I bring flowers to her grave in the small cemetery where she was buried. I usually go in the late afternoon because it's a quiet time when there are almost no visitors. This happened in the fall of 2023. That day I worked as usual and didn't leave the office until around 5:30 p.m. I stopped at a florist in town, bought a bouquet of white lilies, which had always been her favorite flowers, and drove straight to the cemetery. I didn't tell anyone I was going. Not my children, not my siblings. It was a moment I had always preferred to spend alone. The sun was already setting when I parked near the main gate. The place was quiet, as usual, and apparently empty. I walked down the main path until I reached her grave. I still remember exactly how I felt when I saw it. Resting on top of the headstone was a large floral wreath that had obviously just been placed there. The flowers looked fresh, as though they had been delivered only minutes earlier. I thought it was strange because none of my relatives had mentioned they would be visiting that day. I stepped closer, thinking perhaps my children had come earlier without telling me. Attached to the ribbon on the wreath was a small white card. I picked it up to read it. It contained only 2 handwritten words. For Daniel. Nothing else. There was no signature, no date, no message, and no florist's name. Just my first name. I stood there staring at the card for several long seconds. What bothered me most was that nobody knew I would be at the cemetery at that particular time. In fact, I hadn't even been sure myself that I would get out of work early enough. And yet someone had left that tribute on my wife's grave just before I arrived. I spent several minutes trying to imagine who could have left the wreath. My first thought was my children, but I dismissed that idea almost immediately. They lived in different cities and always let me know when they planned to visit their mother's grave. I also considered one of her old friends or someone from church who still remembered the date. Even so, the card still made no sense. If it was a tribute to her, why would it have only my name written on it? I placed my bouquet of lilies beside the wreath and stood there silently for a few more minutes. That's when I got the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching me. I looked up almost instinctively and glanced toward the other side of the cemetery. Near a row of large oak trees stood a man among the graves. He was too far away for me to recognize his face, but I could clearly tell he was completely motionless. He wasn't walking or looking anywhere else. He simply seemed to be watching me. I considered waving to ask whether he needed something, but he didn't react at all. I kept watching him for a few more seconds before feeling a little embarrassed with myself. Maybe he was simply another visitor paying respects to someone buried there. I decided not to think too much about it. I remained at my wife's grave for another few minutes before walking back toward the parking area. Along the way, I discreetly looked over my shoulder 2 or 3 times. The man was still standing in exactly the same place, always motionless, always facing my direction. When I finally reached my car, I pressed the button on my key fob to unlock the doors and looked up. There was another floral wreath resting carefully on the hood of my car. It looked almost identical to the first one. The flowers were still damp, and a second card was attached to the ribbon. My stomach immediately tightened. I picked up the card with trembling hands. This time it contained only one sentence. You still come every year." A chill ran down my spine. I immediately looked back toward where the man had been standing. The space between the graves was now completely empty. I stood beside my car trying to understand how that was even possible. I had just walked across nearly the entire cemetery and hadn't crossed paths with anyone. For that second wreath to be sitting on my hood, someone had to have come right up to my car while I was still standing at my wife's grave, and I hadn't seen or heard a single thing. I looked around the parking area. My car was the only one there. There were no other vehicles parked anywhere nearby. I pulled out my phone to call one of my children, but before doing that, I decided to walk back a short distance to see whether the man was still somewhere among the graves. By then, the sky had grown much darker and the cemetery lights had just come on. I slowly scanned the entire area where he had been standing. There was no one there. I walked through a few more paths, calling out a simple "hello," imagining perhaps he was an employee. The only response was the sound of the wind moving through the trees and dry leaves sliding across the concrete walkway. I decided to return to my car immediately. As I approached it again, I noticed another detail I hadn't seen before. The second wreath wasn't simply resting on the hood. It had been positioned exactly in the center, perfectly aligned with the car's emblem, as though someone had taken great care while placing it there. I looked around once more and began feeling a sense of unease that I couldn't explain. It felt as though someone was still watching me despite being completely out of sight. I quickly got into my car and locked all the doors. Before starting the engine, I looked through the rearview mirror toward the cemetery's main path. For just a moment, I saw a silhouette standing near the gate I had entered through only minutes earlier. I couldn't make out the face or the clothing because of the distance and the fading light. I blinked, trying to focus better. When I looked again, the figure was gone. Even so, I started the engine immediately without getting out to remove the second wreath that was still sitting on my hood. I drove all the way home with the wreath still on the hood because I didn't have the courage to stop anywhere and remove it. Only after pulling into my garage did I finally get out of the car to examine it more closely. I turned the card over several times, looking for a name, a signature, or the logo of a florist. There was absolutely nothing except the handwritten sentence. The following day, I called the only two florists in town that normally delivered wreaths to cemeteries. I sent them photographs of the arrangement and asked whether they recognized it. Both of them told me they had not made either that wreath or the one left on my wife's grave. Later that day, I also spoke with the cemetery administrator. He confirmed that none of the employees had seen a man standing in that part of the cemetery that evening, and that the main gate had remained open throughout visiting hours. According to him, I had been one of the last visitors of the day, but nobody had reported seeing anyone wandering alone among the graves. Several years have passed since then, and I still visit my wife's grave every year on the anniversary of her death. The difference is that now I always go in the morning and never by myself. I still keep the second card inside a drawer at home. Every now and then I come across it and find myself thinking about that night again. I don't believe anything supernatural happened. I'm convinced it was a real person watching me. What I've never been able to explain is how that stranger knew exactly when I would be there, without me telling anyone, and how he managed to place a second wreath on my car, without making a single sound or drawing my attention. Whenever I think back to that evening, the first thing that comes to mind isn't the flowers or the card. It's that man standing on the other side of the cemetery, perfectly still, watching my every move, and the possibility that he had been much closer to me the entire time than I ever realized. Story 4. My name is Eric, I'm 34 years old, and I work making deliveries for a florist in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. Along with weddings, birthdays, and other events, part of my job also involves delivering floral wreaths for funerals at churches and cemeteries throughout the area. After doing this for several years, visiting cemeteries stopped feeling unusual to me. Normally, everything is well organized. The staff know the schedule, show me where to unload the flowers, and sign for the delivery within a few minutes. This happened in early fall of 2023. That day, my last delivery was a large floral wreath for a funeral being held at an old historic cemetery in a small rural town. The service had already ended by the time I arrived. Only a few family members were still leaving, along with a couple of employees collecting chairs near the chapel. It was almost 6 o'clock in the evening, and the sun was already beginning to disappear behind the enormous trees surrounding the property. I wanted to finish the delivery quickly so I could head home. After unloading the flowers and confirming they had been placed at the correct grave, I needed to get an employee's signature to complete the order in the florist's system. A man who was collecting flower pots pointed toward a small administrative building near the oldest section of the cemetery and said I would probably still find someone there. I walked over carrying only my tablet and the delivery paperwork. When I stepped inside, I found only a very elderly man sitting behind a wooden desk. He wore a faded dark green uniform, boots covered in dirt, and a cap with the cemetery's name almost completely worn away by time. I explained that I only needed a signature to finalize the delivery. He signed the paperwork without asking a single question, and before I left, he mentioned that the main gate would be locked in just a few minutes. Then he told me I didn't need to take the longer route back. He said I could simply follow a small shortcut through the oldest section of the cemetery, and I would reach the exit much faster. I thanked him, put away my paperwork, and decided to follow his directions exactly. The path he recommended began behind the administration building and led through a section that looked completely different from the newer part of the cemetery. The walkways were narrow, lined with very old graves, some leaning from age and surrounded by large trees that almost blocked out what remained of the evening light. The place was quiet in a strangely unsettling way. Every so often I glanced at the cemetery map posted on a sign to make sure I was still heading in the right direction. After a few minutes, I looked up and saw the same caretaker walking several paths ahead of me. I thought it was odd because I had left him sitting inside the administration building less than a minute earlier. I assumed there must be another exit behind the building and didn't think much of it. I kept walking normally. When I turned right between two rows of old mausoleums, I lost sight of him for a few seconds. As soon as I entered the next path, he appeared much farther ahead, calmly crossing another walkway between the graves. The distance he had covered in that short amount of time simply didn't make sense. I stopped for a moment, wondering whether I had mistaken him for someone else. Maybe it was another employee wearing the same uniform. I continued walking and decided to pick up my pace so I could catch up to him and thank him for recommending the shortcut. But every time I turned down another path, the same thing happened. I would see him for a few seconds crossing between the graves, and whenever I tried to close the distance, he would appear much farther ahead in another part of the cemetery. He never ran. He never looked back. He simply walked at the same steady pace as though he were leading me along the route. After the fourth time, I began feeling an uneasiness that was difficult to explain. The cemetery wasn't large enough for someone to disappear from one path and reappear so far away only seconds later. I even looked around for hidden shortcuts or trails between the monuments, but I found nothing that could explain it. Even so, I kept following the direction where he kept appearing, believing I would eventually reach the main exit. After walking for several more minutes, I began noticing something else. Every time I saw the caretaker, he appeared at exactly the moment I started doubting whether I was going the right way. Whenever I reached a fork in the path or hesitated between two similar walkways, I would see him slowly crossing ahead of me, almost as if he were pointing me toward the correct direction. Under normal circumstances, that probably would have reassured me. The problem was that I could never get any closer to him. At one point, I decided to take a different path to try to intercept him. I walked more quickly between two rows of headstones and came out exactly where I expected he would pass. There was no one there. I stood still for a few seconds, looking around. That's when I heard the sound of soft footsteps behind me. I turned immediately. The caretaker was already several paths ahead again, walking with the same calm pace as before. It felt as though I was always arriving just a few seconds too late, no matter which direction I chose. By then my uneasiness had grown considerably, but all I wanted was to find the exit and leave. I kept walking until I finally spotted the cemetery's main gate in the distance. I felt an immediate sense of relief. The caretaker was standing near the entrance, partially hidden behind a large stone monument. I thought I would finally catch up to him. I quickened my pace, keeping my eyes fixed on him. I only had to pass a small group of trees before I lost sight of him for a moment. When I reached the same spot just a few seconds later, there was no one near the gate anymore. The area was completely empty. I assumed he had stepped into the entrance booth, so I walked through the gate and found a younger employee closing one of the iron gates. I thanked him for the caretaker's help and mentioned that he had shown me an excellent shortcut through the old section of the cemetery. The young man immediately frowned. He asked, "Which caretaker?" I described the elderly man who had signed my paperwork in the administration office. He remained silent for a few seconds before replying that it was impossible. According to him, every caretaker on that shift had gone home more than an hour earlier, and the administration office had been closed since the funeral ended. At first I thought the employee had misunderstood me. I immediately pulled out the delivery receipt and showed him the signature the old man had written only minutes earlier. He looked at the paper for several seconds and said there really was a signature there, but he didn't recognize the name. Unable to believe it, I asked him to reopen the administration office so we could check. We walked together to the building where I had been less than 15 minutes earlier. The door was locked and all the lights were off. The employee unlocked the entrance with a ring of keys and we went inside. The room was completely empty. The chair behind the desk was neatly pushed in. There was no jacket hanging anywhere, no coffee mug, nothing to suggest that anyone had been working there just moments earlier. When I explained that the old man had signed my paperwork and suggested the shortcut through the old section of the cemetery, he simply replied that the administration office was always closed as soon as the day's funerals were over, and that no one was supposed to remain in that part of the cemetery afterward. From the expression on his face, I could tell he couldn't explain what I had described either. It's been quite some time since that delivery, and I still work for the same florist. I continue making deliveries to cemeteries regularly, but I never take shortcuts through the older sections after business hours anymore. I always follow the main path, even if it takes longer. Every now and then I still come across that delivery receipt filed away among old paperwork. The signature is still there exactly as it was that evening. I've never been able to find out who actually signed it. But what stayed with me the most wasn't discovering that no caretaker had been working that shift. It was remembering the way I kept seeing that old man among the graves always many yards ahead of me, in places where he simply couldn't have reached on foot in the time it took me to get there. Even today, whenever I have to deliver flowers to historic cemeteries near the end of the afternoon, I still instinctively glance toward the oldest walkways, not because I expect to see anything supernatural, but because I've never been able to shake the feeling that evening, someone made a point of guiding me all the way to the exit without ever allowing me to catch up. Story 5. My name is Travis, I'm 33 years old, and this happened to me and my younger brother Ethan in the fall of 2022. Our father was buried in a small cemetery in rural Kentucky after passing away from cancer. Since then, the two of us have kept the tradition of visiting his grave every year on the eve of the anniversary of his death. It was something we always did at night because we both worked until late afternoon, and that was the only time we could go together. The cemetery was located on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by old trees and almost completely unlit, except for a few lampposts near the main gate. We knew the place well, and had never experienced anything unusual there. That evening we left work, bought a bouquet of white flowers, and drove straight to the cemetery. We arrived a little after 7 o'clock. The gate was still open because the cemetery usually didn't close until 8. After parking, we walked along the main path carrying the flowers. Our father's grave was in a more secluded area near the oldest section of the cemetery, where there were several stone burial vaults and old mausoleums. The silence was almost absolute. The only sounds were the wind moving through the trees and dry leaves sliding across the ground. We placed the flowers on the headstone and spent a few minutes talking quietly, remembering old stories from our childhood. When we decided to head back to the car, Ethan drew my attention to a small point of light between the burial vaults. At first I thought it was just a candle left by another family, but as we watched, another small lantern lit up a few yards farther away. Then another. Then another. In less than a minute, there were several small lanterns scattered across the ground, forming what looked like a path leading toward the most isolated part of the cemetery. None of them had been there when we arrived. We also hadn't seen anyone walking among the graves to light them. We stood there watching those lights for several seconds without knowing what to think. My brother suggested that maybe some group was preparing a memorial or a ceremony that would take place later that evening. It sounded reasonable, but there was still something strange about it. The lanterns weren't near the entrance or any area that visitors commonly used. They led directly toward the oldest and most isolated part of the cemetery, where almost no one ever went. Besides that, there wasn't a single person visible among the burial vaults. We remained standing there, expecting someone to appear and light another lantern or explain what was happening. Nothing happened. After a few moments, we agreed that it wasn't any of our business. We decided to simply head back the same way we had come in, completely ignoring the line of lights. We turned our backs on the old section and started walking toward the parking lot without saying much. Only a few yards later, I heard the sound of footsteps coming from the other side of the burial vaults. I stopped immediately. Ethan stopped at exactly the same moment. The silence returned. I assumed another visitor was walking along a parallel path. We started walking again. Almost instantly, the footsteps resumed. They were slow, matching our pace exactly. Whenever we slowed down, they slowed down too. Whenever we picked up our pace, the footsteps returned at almost the same rhythm. The problem was that we could never see who was making the sound. The old burial vaults were tall, built of granite and marble, forming narrow corridors that blocked any clear view beyond them. At one point, Ethan quickly crossed through a narrow passage to see who was walking on the other side. There was no one there. As soon as he came back beside me, the footsteps started again, now several yards farther ahead, continuing parallel to our path as though someone was following us without ever crossing into the same corridor. At that point, we both stopped trying to come up with an explanation. We kept walking toward the parking lot, but now we were paying much closer attention to everything around us. The footsteps never seemed to get any closer. They always remained separated from us by a row of burial vaults, following our exact route. Sometimes we heard dry leaves being stepped on. Other times, it was only the sound of gravel shifting beneath heavy boots. I even called out loudly, asking if someone was there. No one answered. Ethan used his phone's flashlight to illuminate the corridors between the monuments as we walked, but he never found anyone hiding there. What made everything even stranger was that the small lanterns remained lit in the distance, still forming that path disappearing into the oldest part of the cemetery. I had the impression that some of them swayed slightly, as though someone had just walked between them, but they were too far away for me to be certain. The closer we got to the exit, the more I wanted to simply run to the car. The moment we finally saw the parking lot, I felt an enormous sense of relief. Our car was exactly where we had left it. I quickened my pace while Ethan repeatedly looked back over his shoulder. The footsteps continued following us until we reached almost the end of the last corridor of burial vaults. Then they simply stopped. The silence returned all at once. We reached the car, and I unlocked the doors with my key. Before getting inside, Ethan swept his phone's flashlight across the side of the vehicle and suddenly froze. I asked what was wrong. He simply pointed at the passenger door. There was a handprint covered in wet dirt right in the middle of the door panel. When I looked more closely, I noticed another one on the rear window, then another on the trunk lid. I quickly walked around the vehicle, shining the light across the entire body. There were several similar handprints scattered along both sides of the car, as though someone had slowly walked around it, placing muddy hands on every door while we had been at our father's grave. None of those marks had been there when we parked. We got into the car immediately and locked all the doors before I even started the engine. As I turned the key, Ethan kept staring through the window toward the corridor we had just walked through. I asked whether he had seen someone. He only replied that he thought he had noticed a quick movement between the burial vaults, but couldn't tell whether it had actually been a person or just the shadows of the trees moving in the wind. I didn't wait to find out. I drove out of the parking lot and didn't slow down until we were back on the main road. Before heading home, we stopped at a gas station to try to clean the muddy handprints off the car. It was there, under bright lights, that we noticed something we hadn't seen in the darkness. The handprints weren't scattered randomly. Almost all of them were at the height of the door handles and windows, as though someone had slowly walked around the vehicle, touching each door, while we were on the other side of the cemetery. The dirt was still wet, suggesting they had been left only a short time earlier. The following morning, we returned to the cemetery to ask the administrator whether there had been any nighttime ceremony or maintenance taking place in the old section. He said there hadn't. He also mentioned that none of the employees used lanterns like the ones we had seen, and that the parking lot had remained empty for almost the entire evening, We never found out who left those handprints or who had been walking parallel to us among the burial vaults. Since then, my brother and I have continued visiting our father's grave, but only during the daytime. Every time I park in that same spot, I remember the feeling of discovering that someone had been walking around our car while we believed we were completely alone. The footsteps can still be explained somehow. Maybe the lanterns can too. But what I've never been able to explain is how someone managed to leave so many muddy handprints all over the car, without us hearing anyone approach, hearing a single voice, or even the sound of someone crossing the parking lot. Even today, that's still the part of the story that bothers me the most. Story 6. My name is Aaron, I'm 39 years old, and I work as a funeral director at a small family-owned funeral home in rural Georgia. Besides organizing visitations and assisting families, I'm often responsible for preparing the ceremony site at cemeteries throughout the area, especially when the burial is scheduled for early the following morning. This happened in late winter of 2024. That week, one family had requested a very early service because several relatives needed to travel later that same day. Because of that, I was assigned to make sure everything was ready the night before. A little after 7 in the evening, I arrived at a small rural cemetery located a few miles outside of town. The place was surrounded by trees, and there was almost no lighting except for a few lampposts near the administrative office. I had worked there many times before and knew practically all of the employees. That evening, however, the administrator had to leave before I finished the preparations, so I remained completely alone on the property. The grave had already been opened earlier that afternoon, and the casket, still closed, rested on the metal lowering device beside the grave, protected beneath a canopy that had been set up for the ceremony the following morning. I spent nearly half an hour arranging the floral wreaths, checking the chairs, and making a few final adjustments so everything would be ready before I left. The air was quite cold, and the grass was still damp from the rain that had fallen earlier in the day. As I placed the last wreath beside the grave, I had the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching me. I looked up and saw a man standing several yards beyond the casket. He was dressed in dark clothing with his hands in his pockets. He was too far away for me to recognize his face, but it was obvious he was staring directly at the casket. I assumed he might be a family member who had decided to pay one final quiet visit before the funeral. I took a few steps toward him to ask whether he needed any assistance. As soon as I started approaching, the man slowly turned and walked between the rows of graves without saying a single word. I considered following him just to explain that the cemetery had already closed. I walked to the path where he had disappeared, but when I reached it, there was no one there. The area was fairly open, with low headstones and only a few trees. If he had continued walking at the same pace, I still should have been able to see him. I looked in both directions and simply called out, "Sir?" No response. I returned to the gravesite, assuming perhaps he had headed toward the parking lot without me noticing. As I picked up an empty box that had held flower arrangements, I once again felt that same sensation of being watched. I looked up and saw the same man standing in another part of the cemetery, now beside a large granite monument, once again staring at the casket. The distance between that location and the path where I had lost sight of him was far too great for him to have reached it so quickly without me seeing him cross the grounds. Once again, I started walking toward him. The result was exactly the same. Before I had even covered half the distance, he calmly turned away and disappeared among the graves without making a sound. I decided not to pursue him any further. I figured he was probably just a family member who wanted to be alone and preferred to avoid conversation. I finished preparing the area and went to the small administrative office to put away some paperwork and turn off the lights. Before leaving, I decided to check the security cameras that monitored the main entrance and part of the parking lot. The system was simple, but it recorded continuously. I rewound the footage to the moment I had arrived at the cemetery. I watched my car enter through the gate, unload the flowers, and continue toward the ceremony site. Then I fast-forwarded the recording, expecting to see the man's arrival. It never appeared. I reviewed the footage again from the time the administrator left until the moment I first saw the stranger. No one entered through the main gate. No vehicles arrived in the parking lot. The only vehicle recorded during that entire period was mine. At that point, I began wondering if he had entered through one of the side entrances used by the maintenance crew. Even so, that still didn't make much sense because all of those gates remained locked after business hours. I grabbed a more powerful flashlight from the office and decided to make one final walk around the cemetery before leaving. I returned to the ceremony site and found everything exactly as I had left it. The casket was still resting on the lowering device, the flowers remained neatly arranged, and no one was nearby. I walked through several rows of graves, calling out once again, but the only response was the wind moving through the trees. As I was heading back toward the parking lot, I noticed fresh boot prints in the damp soil beside the open grave. At first, I didn't think much of it because several employees had worked there earlier that afternoon. But when I lowered my flashlight for a closer look, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The footprints came from one of the cemetery paths and ended directly beside the grave. There were no footprints leading away from that spot. It was as though the person had simply stopped there and never taken another step. I spent several seconds shining my flashlight across the ground, trying to find where the footprints continued. I walked in circles around the grave, searching for any additional impressions in the damp grass. I found absolutely nothing. The ground was soft enough that any footsteps should have left clear marks, yet there was only that single trail ending beside the open grave. A chill ran down my spine. For the first time that evening, I felt an overwhelming urge to leave without checking anything else. I quickly returned to the office, turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked straight to my car without looking back toward the ceremony site. As I started the engine, I thought I saw someone standing beside the canopy over the grave. I didn't get out to confirm it. I shifted into gear and left the cemetery immediately. The following morning, I arrived at the cemetery before 8 o'clock to oversee the ceremony. The first family members were just beginning to arrive when I met the administrator near the office. I told him about the man I had seen watching the casket, about the security camera footage, and finally about the footprints that ended beside the grave. At first, he assumed it might have been a relative who had entered before visiting ours. When I explained that I had reviewed the recordings and that no one had entered through the main gate during the entire time I was there, he decided to watch the footage with me. We reviewed everything once again. My car appeared arriving. Then the administrator leaving. Later, me walking among the flowers and returning to the office. At no point did anyone else appear entering or leaving through the main entrance. We finished watching the footage in silence. Before turning off the monitor, the administrator simply commented that all the other gates had remained locked throughout the night and that no member of the staff had returned to the cemetery after business hours. I've worked in the funeral profession for many years, and I still believe that almost everything has a logical explanation. People sometimes enter through unexpected places. Cameras have blind spots, and memory doesn't always capture every detail accurately. Even so, there are 3 things from that night that I've never been able to explain together. The first was seeing the same man twice watching the casket, disappearing each time before I could reach him. The second was discovering that he never appeared on the cameras covering the cemetery's only entrance for both vehicles and pedestrians. And the third, which continues to bother me more than anything else, was those footprints in the damp soil. They were fresh, sharp, and deep, yet they ended directly beside the open grave without a single mark showing where the person had gone afterward. Since then, I always finish preparing every ceremony before nightfall. And if for any reason I ever have to remain alone in a cemetery after business hours, I never ignore that feeling that someone is watching the casket before the family even arrives.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.